Far out in the Atlantic, beyond the coast of West Africa, lies Cape Verde, a small chain of islands with a history much larger than its size. Tonight, we'll drift through its story, from silent volcanic shores to Portuguese rule, Creole culture, migration, independence, and democracy. Welcome to Sleep History Night. If you enjoy this journey, please like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, how did you first hear about Cape Verde? And would you ever want to visit? Far out in the Atlantic, west of the African coast, there is a chain of islands that looks, on a map, almost too small to carry the weight of a whole history. Cape Verde does not rise from a great river valley like Egypt, or from a wide plain where armies could march for days. It begins as scattered land in open water, 10 main islands and smaller islets, volcanic in origin, lifted from the ocean floor by forces older than memory. Long before flags, ports, churches, ships, or written names, the islands were stone, wind, salt, and silence. The sea struck their cliffs. Dry air moved across dark ridges. Birds circled over coves where no permanent town waited below. At night, the same stars that guided ancient sailors burned above black volcanic slopes. But the islands themselves seem to have remained outside the settled human world for a very long time. That is the first strange thing about Cape Verde. Its history begins not with a crowded kingdom, but with an absence. And absence, when you look closely, can be just as powerful as ruins. When Portuguese sailors reached these islands in the 15th century, the common historical account says they found no permanent population there. That does not have to mean no human eye had ever seen them before. Sailors from Africa, the Mediterranean, or the Islamic world may have known of islands in this part of the ocean, and old geographic traditions are sometimes discussed as possible hints of earlier awareness. But knowing of a place and building a lasting society there are two very different things. So the careful way to say it is this. Before Portuguese settlement, there is no widely accepted evidence of an established, permanent community on the Cape Verde Islands. That single detail changes the entire story. Many colonies were built by conquering existing societies. Cape Verde, in contrast, became a colonial world made almost from the beginning through movement. People brought in, people passing through, people forced into new relationships by ocean routes, power, labor, survival, and distance. But before all of that, before the human noise, the islands waited in the Atlantic like dark anchors thrown into blue water. Their position was the secret. They lay several hundred miles off the coast of West Africa, far enough to feel isolated, but close enough to become useful once European sailing expanded southward along the African coast. To a person standing on one of those beaches, the horizon might look empty in every direction. To a navigator in the age of exploration, that same emptiness could look like opportunity. Islands were not just land. They were stopping points, storage places, signals of wind and current, places where ships could recover, repair, and redirect. The Atlantic was becoming a new kind of road, and Cape Verde sat near one of its future crossroads. The islands themselves were not all the same. Some were mountainous and dramatic, with cliffs and valleys cut by time. Others were flatter, drier, and more exposed, with pale beaches and low ground shaped by wind. The names that later became familiar, Santiago, Fogo, Santo Antão, São Vicente, Sal, Boa Vista, Maio, São Nicolau, Brava, Santa Luzia would each take on its own personality, but at the beginning they were mostly possibilities. Santiago would become the first great center of settlement. Fogo, with its volcano, would remind everyone that these islands had not been born gently. Sal and Boa Vista, later known for beaches and salt and tourism, were once part of a much quieter geography of dryness and distance. Even the climate helped shape the future. Cape Verde was not a lush tropical paradise in the easy sense. Rain could be scarce and unreliable. Fresh water mattered. Soil mattered. Shelter mattered. These limitations would later push people to adapt, to migrate, to depend on the sea and on connections beyond the islands. But at the beginning, those same conditions may help explain why the archipelago did not develop a large settled society before the Portuguese arrived. An island can be beautiful and still be difficult. A place can look like refuge from far away, then reveal that survival there demands patience, planning, and outside support. This is why the emptiness of early Cape Verde should not be imagined as emptiness without meaning. It was a geography waiting for a certain historical moment. The moment when ships, empire, trade, and ambition would make isolated islands suddenly valuable. In the mid-1400s, Portugal was pushing farther into the Atlantic world. Its sailors were learning winds and currents, mapping coastlines, and building a chain of knowledge that turned fear of the open sea into strategy. For centuries, the Atlantic had been a boundary in the imagination of many people, a vast western unknown. But in the 15th century, it was slowly being transformed into a working space. Mariners did not simply sail straight into mystery. They learned patterns. They watched birds, clouds, watercolor, and the behavior of wind. They understood that the ocean had invisible pathways. In that world, Cape Verde became visible not merely as land, but as an answer to a problem. Ships needed stepping stones. Empires needed footholds. And these islands, silent for so long, were close enough to Africa and far enough into the Atlantic to matter. The traditional account places the Portuguese discovery of the islands around 1460, with names such as Antonio da Noli and Diogo Gomes often connected to the story, though, as with many early voyages, the details can vary depending on the source. That uncertainty is worth keeping. History at sea is rarely as clean as a date carved in stone. A sailor sees land. Another reports it, a crown claims it, a map records it, and later generations turn the moment into an official beginning. But out on the water, the actual moment may have been quieter. A lookout noticing a shape on the horizon, the dark rise of an island under clouds, the sudden knowledge that the empty blue had changed. Imagine the first approach. A wooden ship moving under sail, its crew tired from heat, salt, and uncertainty. Ahead, the outline of land grows slowly. Not a green continent, not a crowded harbor, but bare ridges, volcanic rock, dry slopes, and beaches where waves break without witnesses. For the sailors, the discovery may have felt like possession. For the islands, if we allow ourselves a more poetic view, it was the end of a long silence. The first chapter of recorded Cape Verdean history began when outsiders realized that these islands could serve a larger plan. that larger plan would not remain innocent for long. The Portuguese crown and its navigators were not wandering without purpose. They were searching for routes, resources, influence, and advantage. They were moving along the West African coast, competing for knowledge that could become wealth. Cape Verde's value was not hidden in gold mines or ancient cities. Its value was location. That is sometimes the most powerful resource of all. A small island in the right place can change the movement of ships. A harbor in the right place can pull distant economies toward it. A settlement in the right place can become a hinge between continents. And once Cape Verde entered that system, it would never again be only a remote archipelago. It would become a station of the Atlantic Age, a place where Europe and Africa met under unequal conditions, and where a new society would slowly form from separation, pressure, adaptation, and memory. But in this first moment, before the town of Ribeira Grande, before the rise of Cidade Velha, before the churches and fortifications, before the labor systems and forced migrations that would stain the centuries to come, there is still a haunting image worth holding. Islands alone in the ocean, created by fire, carved by wind, and waiting in silence until history finally found them. That silence is not empty. It is the deep breath before the story. Because once the first ships came, Cape Verde would no longer be a forgotten scatter of volcanic land. It would become one of the early doorways into the Atlantic world, and the people who eventually lived there would inherit a history shaped not by one homeland, but by many shores. Once Portuguese sailors understood that these islands were not just shadows on the horizon, but land that could be claimed, mapped, and used, Cape Verde began to move from silence into strategy. To modernize, it is easy to imagine discovery as a single clean moment. A sail appears, a captain steps ashore, a flag is raised, and history begins. But in the 15th century, history at sea was slower and messier than that. Knowledge traveled through rumors, ship logs, royal permissions, merchants' calculations, and the memory of men who had survived weather they could barely describe. What mattered to Portugal was not simply that Cape Verde existed. What mattered was what the islands could become. By the mid-1400s, Portugal was pushing farther down the western coast of Africa, driven by a mixture of religious ambition, royal competition, trade, curiosity, and the cold mathematics of power. The Atlantic was no longer just a frightening emptiness west of Europe. It was being turned into a working ocean, a space where winds could be studied, islands could be occupied, and distance itself could be organized. In that world, Cape Verde's location was almost too valuable to ignore. The islands stood off the coast of West Africa, close enough to connect with African trade routes, far enough into the Atlantic to serve as a forward base, and positioned along the expanding routes that would later tie Europe, Africa, Brazil, and the Caribbean into one vast, unequal system. A place that had once seemed remote now looked like a key. That is why the Portuguese did not treat Cape Verde as a passing curiosity. Around 1462, settlers began establishing themselves on Santiago, the island that would become the first real center of Portuguese Cape Verde. Santiago was not chosen by accident. It was large, comparatively useful, and better suited than many of the drier islands for building a permanent foothold. Its valleys offered possibilities for water and farming, and its southern coast gave the Portuguese a position facing the sea lanes they cared about most. There, they founded Ribeira Grande, the settlement later known as Cidade Velha, and from the beginning it carried more weight than its size suggested. It was not a grand imperial capital in the way Lisbon was, and it was not an ancient city grown slowly over centuries from local roots. It was a designed foothold, a colonial instrument placed into the tropics with a purpose. The streets, the harbour, the church, the storehouses, the early houses of settlers and officials, all of it belonged to a new kind of Atlantic experiment. Portugal had already learned from Madeira and the Azores that islands could be transformed into stations of empire, but Cape Verde was different. It sat beside Africa, at the edge of worlds that Europeans were still trying to understand and control. Ribeira Grande became the place where plans made in Portugal touched the reality of African coasts, Atlantic winds, and human lives caught in between. If you picture the settlement in its earliest years, do not imagine it too polished. Imagine instead a rough and anxious beginning. Ships unloading tools, livestock, seeds, timber, barrels, religious objects, and people who were not always there by choice. Imagine sailors looking for fresh water, officials trying to impose order, settlers testing soil that did not behave like Europe, and African captives and laborers becoming part of the settlement almost from the start. There was ambition in the air, but also uncertainty. Every colonial foothold had to prove that it could survive. The island had heat, dry seasons, unfamiliar diseases, limited resources, and the constant danger of isolation. A ship might connect you to the world, but if the next ship did not come, the sea became a wall. This tension shaped early Cape Verde. It was a bridge, but it was also a trap. It promised access to the Atlantic, yet every life there depended on fragile lines of supply, water, weather, and command. The Portuguese crown saw the islands as useful because they could support voyages and trade. But usefulness did not mean comfort. It meant labor. It meant experiments in settlement. It meant turning a volcanic archipelago into a functioning colonial base, one decision at a time. Santiago grew because the Atlantic system around it was growing. Ships moving along the African coast needed places to stop. Men involved in trade needed a base. The crown needed a way to extend authority over waters and routes that were still unstable. Ribeira Grande, sitting in a valley by the sea, became that kind of place. Half town, half station, half warning that the Atlantic age was no longer just about exploration, but about possession. And what makes this moment so important is that Cape Verde was not merely added to Portuguese maps. It began to change what those maps meant. A map is not only a drawing of land. In the hands of an empire, it becomes a plan for movement. Once Cape Verde was on Portuguese maps, it could be folded into royal privileges, trading licenses, missionary efforts, settlement policies, and the expanding commerce of the ocean. The islands became a point from which people could be sent outward and through which others could be brought in. This is where the story begins to darken, though we do not need to rush into that darkness too quickly. The same harbor that made Cape Verde valuable for navigation also made it useful for a trade in human beings. The same location that made Ribeira Grande a strategic base also pulled it into one of the most painful systems of the early modern world. But in this chapter, the crucial thing to understand is the structure before the full consequences. Portugal did not build Ribeira Grande as a simple village. It became a hinge. It connected the Portuguese kingdom to the West African coast. It connected sailors to supplies. It connected merchants to routes. It connected church officials to the dream of conversion and control. And eventually, it connected forced migration to the wider Atlantic world. That is why historians pay attention to Cidade Velha. It is not only old stone and quiet ruins. It is evidence of a turning point, one of the earliest European colonial urban centers in the tropics, a place where the Atlantic world took a more permanent shape. When you stand in the imagination near the old settlement, you can almost hear two histories at once. One is the history Portugal wanted to tell about itself. Brave sailors, Christian mission, royal expansion, clever navigation, and the building of order in distant seas. The other is the history that grew underneath it. Labor, inequality, adaptation, survival, African presence, cultural mixing, and the beginning of a society that would never be simply Portuguese, even if Portugal claimed it. That second history is harder to control, and in many ways it is the one that lasts longer. Empires often believe they are creating copies of themselves overseas, but islands have a way of changing whatever arrives on their shores. Cape Verde took Portuguese language, law, religion, and authority, but it also absorbed African experience, Atlantic movement, and the daily improvisations of people trying to live in a place that gave nothing easily. The result would not appear overnight. At first, there was only the settlement, the harbor, the church bell, the administrator's orders, the sound of ship carpenters, the smell of salt, animals, smoke, and wet rope. But under those ordinary details, a new world was forming. The Portuguese had come looking for a foothold. They found one. Yet the foothold did not remain merely theirs. It became the beginning of Cape Verdean history as a human story, not just a colonial project. That is the quiet twist at the heart of this chapter. A kingdom far away looked at these islands and saw a tool for navigation, trade, supply, and influence. But once people began living there, suffering there, working there, praying there, speaking to each other there, and raising children there, the islands became something else. They became a place with memory, and memory is never as obedient as empire wants it to be. By the time Ribeira Grande began to grow, Cape Verde had crossed an invisible line. It was no longer just a useful stop in the Atlantic. It was becoming a society, fragile and uneven, but real. The harbor that welcomed Portuguese ships would soon welcome merchants, priests, officials, captives, sailors, and strangers from different shores. The valley would gather voices that did not share one origin. The island would become a meeting ground shaped by power, but also by human closeness, necessity, and invention. And this is why the arrival of the Portuguese matters so much. Not because they simply found islands, but because they turned those islands into a stage where the future Atlantic world could begin to rehearse itself. In the next part of the story, that stage will have a name that still echoes through Cape Verde's history. Cidade Velha, the Old City, the first heart of the archipelago, and one of the places where the modern Atlantic began to reveal both its promise and its wound. Cidade Velha does not feel like the kind of place that should hold the beginning of an Atlantic world, and that is exactly what makes it so haunting. Its name means Old City, but the older name, Ribeira Grande, tells you what first drew people there: a valley, water, shelter, and a way down to the sea. On the southern coast of Santiago, the settlement grew in a place where the land opened just enough to let a town breathe. Behind it rose dry slopes and dark volcanic ground. In front of it stretched the Atlantic, beautiful, dangerous, and full of roots that were only beginning to harden into empire. If you imagine it only as ruins, you miss the force of what it once was. This was not just a cluster of stone walls at the edge of an island. It was the first heart of Cape Verde, the place where the archipelago stopped being a distant possession on a royal map and became a living, crowded, unstable, deeply human town. Ships came in from Portugal, from the African coast, from other islands, from routes that widened year by year. Some arrived with orders and permissions. Some came for trade. Some carried priests, officials, merchants, craftsmen, sailors, and people whose names were never carefully preserved. The harbour made the town possible, but the valley made it livable. In an island world where fresh water could decide the future of a settlement, Ribeira Grande had an advantage that could not be ignored. That advantage explains why power gathered there. Towns are often born where geography gives permission, and here, geography whispered yes. The first streets were not random scratches in the dust. They followed the needs of a colonial town trying to turn itself into a permanent base. Paths from the port, routes toward homes and storehouses, religious spaces, administrative buildings, and places where authority could make itself visible. Over time, Ribeira Grande developed the marks of a European colonial center in the tropics. Churches, a fortress, a central square, and a street layout that still leaves traces of its original design. Those stones matter because they show us how empire tried to make distance familiar. A church bell could make an Atlantic valley sound like part of Christendom. A fortress on high ground could make a vulnerable harbour look controlled. A pillory in a public square could turn law into a physical warning. Every building spoke a language of order, but beneath that order was a town shaped by tension. Cidade Velha became important because it stood between worlds, and places between worlds are rarely peaceful for long. From its streets, Portugal could watch the African coast, support voyages southward, and participate in the maritime trade that was transforming the ocean. But the town was also exposed. It faced the sea that enriched it and threatened it. It depended on ships that could bring supplies, news, wealth, disease, fear, and strangers. A settlement like this never slept completely. Even at night, the anchorage mattered. Somewhere, sailors repaired rigging under dim light. Somewhere, traders argued over cargo. Somewhere, a priest wrote records in a hand that later historians would study like clues. Somewhere, people born in different worlds learned enough of each other's speech to bargain, command, obey, resist, pray, and survive. This is the deeper importance of Cidade Velha. It was not only a Portuguese place placed on African water. It was one of the early laboratories of the Atlantic world, a town where categories that seemed solid in Europe began to blur under the pressure of daily life. The officials might have wanted hierarchy to be clear, But island life was practical. People needed water, labor, food, repairs, protection, and information. In that necessity, cultures touched constantly. Portuguese words entered new mouths and changed shape. African knowledge entered the settlement in ways that official documents often failed to honor. Religious life mixed discipline with devotion, ritual with local experience. Even the landscape took part in the story. The dry hills around the town limited easy growth, forcing people to depend on trade and connections. The sea made the town outward-facing, always listening for sails. Unlike an inland capital, Ribeira Grande could never pretend the wider world was far away. The wider world was at its doorstep every time a ship appeared. The monuments that remain today are quiet, but in the 16th century they were full of meaning. The royal fortress, later standing above the town, was not decoration. It answered a fear that every port in the Atlantic understood. Wealth attracts violence, and a harbor without defense is an invitation. The churches were not only places of worship, they marked the spread of Portuguese authority and Catholic identity in a region where empire and faith often traveled together. Pillory Square, with its stone column, reminds us that colonial law wanted to be seen, not merely written. It is uncomfortable to look at such a monument only as architecture, because its purpose was tied to public punishment, control, and social rank. Yet that discomfort is part of why the place matters. Cidade Velha preserves not a simple golden age, but a layered past in which beauty, ambition, cruelty, faith, and survival stood close together in the same streets. That is why the old city holds a strange kind of power. It refuses to be only picturesque. It asks you to look again. A ruined wall may appear peaceful now, warmed by sun and wind, but when it was new, it belonged to a system expanding across oceans. A church ruin may look romantic in the late afternoon, but it once gathered people into a world of conversion, law, confession, baptism, discipline, and hope. A harbor may seem calm today, but it once pulled the island into networks that carried goods, people, and power across enormous distances. The Atlantic Age did not begin in one city alone. It took shape in many places. Lisbon, Elmina, São Tomé, Madeira, the Caribbean, Brazil, and countless ports along African and American shores. But Cidade Velha deserves attention because it stood so early in that transformation, and because its scale makes the story feel almost personal. It was not enormous, and perhaps that is why it is easier to imagine. You can picture a single street descending toward the water. You can picture footsteps over stone after rain. You can picture a shipmaster climbing toward an official building with papers tucked under his arm. You can picture a child hearing several languages in one day and thinking that this was simply what the world sounded like. In large capitals, history can feel abstract. In Cidade Velha, it feels close enough to touch. Archaeology has helped make that closeness even stronger, because written records tend to preserve the voices of officials, priests, merchants, and the powerful, while objects and building remains can point toward lives that were less carefully recorded. A foundation, a wall, a burial place, a fragment of pottery, the organization of early religious structures, the way streets and domestic spaces developed. These details can reveal what documents smooth over. They remind us that the city was not just administered from above, it was lived from below. It changed through ordinary repetition. Meals cooked, water carried, tools used, prayers spoken, children born, ships repaired, deals made, illnesses endured, and memories formed. And as those repetitions continued, Ribeira Grande became more than a Portuguese project. It became the first center of a Cape Verdean world still in formation. The identity that would later be called Cape Verdean did not arrive fully made. It emerged slowly from pressure, mixing, separation, and adaptation. Cidade Velha was the first place where that process became visible in stone and street. The town's importance eventually faded as other centers rose, especially Praia, and Ribeira Grande would later be renamed Cidade Velha, the Old City, as if its main role had become memory. But old cities do not vanish simply because power moves away. Sometimes they become even more revealing after they are no longer trying to impress anyone. The ruins stop performing and start confessing. They show what mattered, what failed, what endured, and what people were willing to build at the edge of uncertainty. Cidade Velha's silence today is not the same as the island's silence before settlement. This is a human silence, thick with traces. It is the quiet after footsteps, after bells, after orders, after prayers, after sails disappearing into the horizon. And if Cape Verde has a first historical heartbeat, it is here, in this old valley by the sea, where a small colonial town became a doorway between continents. But every doorway has two sides. The same roots that made Cidade Velha important also drew it into the darker commerce of the Atlantic, where human lives were counted, moved, and controlled as part of a growing system. To understand Cape Verde honestly, we have to follow that shadow next, not with shock for its own sake, but with the calm attention history demands. The shadow over Cape Verde's early history did not fall all at once. It arrived gradually with ships, permissions, bargains, royal papers, coastal contacts, and the growing realization that this small Atlantic settlement could be used for something far more profitable than sheltering sailors. Ribeira Grande had begun as a foothold, but in the logic of the 15th and 16th centuries, a foothold near West Africa could quickly become a gateway into a trade that treated human lives as cargo. This is the part of the story that has to be approached carefully, because if it is told only as horror, it becomes distant. If it is told too gently, it becomes dishonest. The truth sits in the uncomfortable space between. Cape Verde's location made it useful, and usefulness in an empire often meant that someone else would pay the cost. In 1466, Portugal granted trading privileges connected to the West African coast, especially the region between Senegambia and Guinea, and that decision helped turn Ribeira Grande into one of the most important early Atlantic centers for the trafficking of enslaved Africans. The town did not create the violence of slavery by itself, and it was not the only place where this system developed, but it became one of the places where the system learned how to move through the ocean. That is what makes Cape Verde historically significant and morally heavy at the same time. It stood at the edge of Africa, but not on the mainland. It was close enough for ships to reach coastal trading networks, yet far enough offshore to serve as a holding place, a sorting point, a base of exchange, and a place where the Portuguese could try to manage movement between continents. In the old streets of Ribeira Grande, The Atlantic slave trade was not an abstract system. It was made practical. Ships came and went. Officials counted and recorded. Merchants calculated risk and profit. Religious authorities spoke of conversion, while economic power hardened around forced labor. Goods moved beside people. Cloth, livestock, sugar, cotton, wine, weapons, tools, and food could all become part of a chain of exchange that drew the islands deeper into the economy of coercion. What had once been a volcanic archipelago in open water became a mechanism within a much larger machine. And yet the machine was never perfectly controlled. Empires like to imagine clean systems. Commands sent from Lisbon, orders obeyed overseas, profits returned neatly to the crown. But the Atlantic world was too wide, too fluid, and too human for that. Local traders, Luso-African families, sailors, interpreters, coastal brokers, priests, captives, and settlers all shaped what happened on the ground. Some followed royal law, some bent it. Some ignored it when profit or survival demanded another path. That ambiguity matters because it reminds us that history was not only made by kings and captains. It was made in harbors, in negotiations, in fear, in silence, in small decisions that rarely made it into official records. Ribeira Grande grew wealthy for a time because it was positioned at the hinge of these movements. But wealth in such a place was not a simple sign of success. It was evidence that the town had become entangled in a system that separated people from homes, languages, names, and futures. The tragedy is not only that people were taken across the sea, it is that the sea itself was reorganized to make that taking repeatable. Routes were learned. Ports were prepared, legal excuses were built, religious justifications were shaped, markets adjusted, and little by little, violence became administration. That may be one of the most disturbing truths of the Atlantic slave trade. It did not always look chaotic to the people who profited from it. It looked organized. It had documents, payments, ships, schedules, and rules. But order is not the same as justice. In Cape Verde, the order of empire left marks in stone and memory. The pillory in Cidade Velha, the churches, the fortifications, the street patterns, the old harbor, all of them belonged to a world where public authority and human suffering stood close together. A traveler today might see sunlight over ruins and feel peace. But history asks us to hold two images at once, the beauty of the place and the purpose it once served. This is not easy, but it is necessary. The old city was a meeting point of cultures, yes, but those encounters did not happen on equal terms. Portuguese settlers and officials brought law, language, Catholic ritual, and claims of authority. Africans brought knowledge, labor, memory, skills, belief, and endurance, often under conditions they had not chosen. Out of this forced closeness, something new slowly began to form. UNESCO describes Ribeira Grande not only as a place tied to the trade and enslaved people, but also as a place of exceptional intercultural encounter, linked to the emergence of an early Creole society. That phrase can sound almost too smooth unless we pause over it. A Creole society did not appear because cultures met politely around a table. It emerged from pressure, from unequal power, daily dependence, shared survival, intimate contact, and generations of people born into a world that could not be described as simply African or simply Portuguese. In Cape Verde, language itself began to carry this history. Speech had to bridge command and resistance, trade and family, church and marketplace, memory and necessity. What would later become Cape Verdean Creole was not just a mixture of words. It was a sign that a new society was taking shape in the cracks of empire. This is where the wound of the Atlantic becomes more complex than loss alone. Loss was real and enormous, but so was creation. People who were meant to be reduced to labor remained human. And human beings make culture, even under terrible pressure. They build relationships, remember songs, adapt food, reshape faith, raise children, invent speech, and turn survival into identity. That does not soften the violence. It reveals the failure of the system to erase the people inside it. Ribeira Grande was meant to serve the ambitions of empire, but it also became the birthplace of a Cape Verdean world that empire could never fully command. Still, we should be careful not to romanticize resilience in a way that hides what caused the need for resilience in the first place. The Atlantic slave system was not a dramatic background to Cape Verde's history. It was one of the forces that structured early society, economy, and population. Enslaved Africans were brought to the islands from the nearby coast, used in agriculture, domestic labor, maritime work, and trade networks, and sometimes re-exported across the ocean. The islands became connected to routes reaching toward Brazil, the Caribbean, Europe, and other Atlantic colonies. Every voyage added another thread. Every thread made the web harder to escape. And as the town grew, its people lived inside contradictions that could not be neatly resolved. A church could baptize a person while the society around that person denied freedom. A merchant could pray in the morning and profit from suffering by afternoon. A settlement could become culturally rich while being economically tied to exploitation. This is why Cape Verde's early history feels so layered. It refuses the comfort of a single label. It was a colonial outpost, a trade station, a religious center, a place of forced movement, and a cradle of cultural formation all at once. Perhaps that is why Cidade Velha still holds such a quiet power. It does not let us separate civilization from violence, or culture from coercion, or memory from stone. It shows how the modern Atlantic world was built not only by explorers and kings, but by people whose lives were pulled into motion without consent, and by descendants who would later turn that painful beginning into a distinct identity. By the time the slave trade had fully marked Cape Verde, the islands had already changed forever. They were no longer empty Atlantic land, and they were no longer merely Portuguese stations. They had become inhabited by a society born from unequal contact, shaped by the sea, and marked by a wound that would echo far beyond the old harbor. The next question is not simply how Cape Verde survived that wound. It is how, from such a beginning, a people began to recognize themselves as something new. A Creole society did not appear in Cape Verde as a sudden invention, and it was never as simple as two cultures meeting and blending into something smooth. It formed slowly, unevenly, almost quietly at first, inside kitchens, courtyards, fields, chapels, ships, market spaces, and family lines that crossed boundaries no empire could fully manage. The Portuguese had brought their language, religion, laws, names, tools, and expectations of authority, but they had also brought themselves into a place where survival depended on more than commands from Lisbon. The islands demanded adaptation. The sea controlled timing. Rain could not be ordered. Labor had to be organized. Food had to be grown or imported. Animals had to be kept alive. Ships had to be supplied. And people from very different origins had to communicate every day. Out of that daily pressure, Cape Verdean society began to take shape, not as a copy of Portugal and not as a preserved fragment of West Africa, but as something born in between. This is the strange force of island history. It compresses distance. On the mainland, communities may live apart for generations, separated by kingdoms, forests, rivers, or languages. On a small Atlantic island, people who might never have met elsewhere are placed within sight and sound of one another. They work near one another, argue, trade, pray, fear the same drought, wait for the same ships, and eventually raise children who inherit more than one world. Those children are where the deeper story begins. They grew up in a society where Portuguese power was visible, but African presence was everywhere, where Catholic rituals marked public life, but older rhythms of memory, healing, music, food, and family did not simply vanish, where the official language belonged to administration, but the living language of the people was being reshaped mouth by mouth. Cape Verdean Creole, often called Creole, became one of the clearest signs that a new society was forming. It was not only a convenient way to speak, it was a record of contact. Its vocabulary drew strongly from Portuguese, but its life, sound, structure, and uses were shaped by the African peoples who carried their own languages and ways of thinking into the islands. Scholars still debate the exact process by which the language formed, because early documentation is limited, and because the voices of ordinary people were not preserved with the same care as colonial records. Some explanations emphasize simplified Portuguese used for trade and command. Others emphasize African speakers reshaping Portuguese through their own linguistic patterns. Still others look at how island-born generations stabilized a new language naturally over time. The safest truth may be that no single theory captures all of it. Languages are not built like forts. They grow like paths, worn into the ground by repeated use. In Cape Verde, Creole grew because people needed a language that belonged to the life they were actually living, not the life officials imagined on paper. It could carry instruction, affection, warning, bargaining, prayer, jokes, grief, lullabies, and memory. That matters because the language of a people is not just a tool. It is where the world becomes familiar. A child born on Santiago or Fogo could hear Portuguese in church or administration, African echoes in family speech and song, and the island's own developing Creole in the ordinary sounds of home. Over time, that child would not experience identity as a clean division. The child would grow inside mixture as reality itself. This is why the formation of Cape Verdean society cannot be understood only through race, law, or empire, though all of those matter deeply. It also has to be understood through habit. What did people eat? How did they name children? Which saints did they honor? Which stories survived around evening fires? How did people speak when no official was listening? Which songs crossed from work into celebration? Which gestures of respect came from Portugal and which came from African customs, and which became something new because the island changed them? These are the small questions that reveal a society more clearly than a royal decree. Cape Verde's early Creole world developed through a complicated hierarchy, with Europeans, Africans, free people of mixed ancestry, enslaved people, freed people, island-born families, and outsiders moving through overlapping roles. Some individuals gained property, status, or influence. Others remained trapped by systems they did not choose. This meant Creole society was not automatically equal or harmonious. It carried the marks of power from the beginning. But it also created spaces where identity could not be controlled as neatly as colonial categories suggested. A person might carry a Portuguese surname and African ancestry. A family might attend Mass and still preserve older forms of social memory. A community might speak a language born from inequality and yet turn that language into intimacy, humor, poetry, and belonging. That is one of Cape Verde's deepest historical paradoxes. The same forces that tried to rank people also brought them close enough to create a shared world. The islands themselves helped shape that world. Santiago, as the earliest center, gave the first strong form to Cape Verdean Creole life. But the story did not stay there. As settlements spread to Fogo, São Nicolau, Santo Antão, Brava, Boa Vista, Maio, São Vicente, Sal, and other islands, local variations emerged. Geography mattered. A mountainous island created different habits from a flat, dry island. A port town heard more foreign voices than an inland farming valley. A community shaped by volcano soil felt different from one shaped by salt flats or grazing land. So even as Cape Verdeans gradually came to share a broader identity, each island kept its own tone. That island-by-island variation would later become part of the country's richness. One nation, but many voices. One Creole world, but not one identical sound. This makes Cape Verde different from places where national identity was built first by a powerful capital and then pushed outward. Here, identity grew across scattered islands, connected by ships, family ties, church networks, trade, migration, and memory. The sea separated people, but it also taught them to imagine connection. You could be from one island and still understand that another island belonged to the same wider story. You could leave home and still carry the speech, music, and manners of the archipelago with you. In this way, Creole society was not only a product of the past, it was a preparation for the future, because Cape Verdeans would later become one of the great island diasporas of the Atlantic. The habit of belonging across water began early. Faith also played a complicated role in this formation. Catholicism was central to Portuguese colonial life, and churches marked the moral and social order the authorities wanted to build. But religion in Cape Verde, like language, could not remain untouched by the people who practiced it. A prayer spoken in a colonial church did not mean the same thing for everyone inside. For officials, it could represent order. For the poor, the enslaved, the freed, and the island-born, it could become comfort, hope, obligation, fear, or community. Religious festivals, baptisms, marriages, funerals, and saints' days became part of the rhythm through which people recognized one another. Over generations, imported forms took on local breath. The result was not a rejection of Catholic influence, but neither was it a pure copy. It became Cape Verdean because the people living it made it so. The same was true of food, music, and social life. Ingredients came from different worlds, but hunger made them practical. Rhythms carried memory, but island life gave them new moods. The sound of Cape Verde would later be famous for saudade, that deep, tender ache of longing. But the roots of that feeling were already present in the Creole formation itself. People remembering places they had lost. Children inheriting places they had never seen. Families learning to belong to islands that were both home and evidence of displacement. This is where the story becomes more than a historical process. It becomes emotional geography. Cape Verdean identity was built from crossings, forced crossings, chosen crossings, ocean crossings, cultural crossings, and inner crossings between memory and survival. A society born this way does not need a massive empire or a vast population to matter. Its significance lies in how clearly it reveals the Atlantic world in human form. In Cape Verde, you can see how empire tried to organize people, how people reorganized themselves, and how a new identity emerged from conditions that were never simple. By the time Creole society had taken root, the islands had become something no royal planner could have fully predicted. They were still under Portuguese rule, still vulnerable, still marked by inequality and dependence. But they now held a people with their own speech, habits, memories, and ways of seeing the world. Cape Verde was no longer just a place where others passed through. It was becoming a homeland. And once a homeland forms, even on dry volcanic islands in the middle of the Atlantic, history changes direction. The next great force would not come from ships alone, but from the land itself. The fragile soil, the unreliable rain, the hunger that returned in cycles, and the painful truth that for many Cape Verdeans, survival would eventually mean leaving the very islands that had made them who they were. In Cape Verde, hunger was never only a private struggle inside one household. It was a force that moved through the islands like weather, shaping choices, families, labor, politics, and eventually the meaning of home itself. The same geography that had made the archipelago useful to empire also made everyday survival fragile. These were not islands with wide rivers, deep forests, or endless fields waiting to be planted. They were volcanic, scattered, exposed to winds, and dependent on rains that could arrive late, arrive weak, or fail almost completely. A good season could make the valleys feel alive, with corn rising, beans spreading, goats moving along the slopes, and families measuring hope by the color of the land. They were volcanic, scattered, exposed to winds, and dependent on rains that could arrive late, arrive weak, or fail almost completely. A good season could make the valleys feel alive, with corn rising, beans spreading, goats moving along the slopes, and families measuring hope by the color of the land. But a dry season could change the mood of an entire island. The earth would harden. Hillsides would lose their thin green skin. Wells and springs would become objects of anxiety. People watched the sky not as scenery, but as judgment. In places where rain is reliable, drought is an interruption. In Cape Verde, drought became a recurring chapter of history. From at least the late 16th century onward, the island suffered repeated crises of drought, crop failure, famine, and epidemic disease. And those crises were not accidents floating outside politics. Climate opened the wound, but colonial neglect, poverty, land inequality, poor infrastructure, and dependence on fragile crops often made the wound deeper. That is why the story cannot be told as if nature alone was responsible. Rainfall failed, yes, but systems failed too. Colonial authorities often moved slowly or inadequately. Local people were left to absorb the shock of a landscape that gave very little margin for error. The islands grew maize, beans, and other crops, but maize in particular needed more rain than Cape Verde could always provide. When the rains failed, a family did not simply lose a harvest. It lost seed, food, animals, future bargaining power, and sometimes the ability to stay where it had always lived. Poverty in this setting was not just lack of money, it was exposure. It meant that one bad rainy season could become debt, and two bad seasons could become migration, hunger, or death. The harshness of this history helps explain something essential about Cape Verdean identity. Leaving was not always a rejection of home. Very often, leaving was the only way to keep home alive. That is the quiet tragedy and strength at the center of the Cape Verdean story. People went away so that families might remain. They crossed the sea not because the islands meant little to them, but because the islands meant so much that someone had to search beyond them for survival. At first, migration was tied to the same Atlantic routes that had shaped Cape Verde from the beginning. Ships came for supplies, crew, trade, and movement. Cape Verdean men, especially, found paths into maritime work, and by the 19th century, one of the most important routes led toward New England. American whaling vessels regularly stopped at the islands, especially as the whaling industry expanded across the Atlantic. And Cape Verdeans joined crews that sailed far beyond the horizon their families could see. For an American listener, this is one of the hidden bridges in the story. Cape Verde is not as distant from American history as it seems. The old ports of New Bedford, Nantucket, Providence, and other coastal communities are part of this same ocean memory. Cape Verdean sailors helped cruise ships in one of the great maritime industries of the 19th century, and some settled in New England, building communities that still carry island names, island food, island music, and island memory generations later. But before migration became a proud diaspora, it was often born from pressure. In the mid-19th century, severe drought and poverty pushed many Cape Verdeans toward whaling ships and other work abroad. The choice must have been heavy. To leave an island is different from leaving a village on the mainland. On the mainland, the road may curve back through fields and towns. On an island, the road ends at water. Once you step onto a ship, return depends on wind, money, papers, employers, and luck. The sea that connected Cape Verde to opportunity also turned departure into something final feeling, even when people hoped to come back. Imagine a young man standing near a harbor with little more than clothing, a few family words, and the knowledge that the land behind him could not feed everyone. Ahead of him is a ship whose world is dangerous, disciplined, and uncertain. Behind him are parents, siblings, maybe a wife, maybe children, and a house where every absence will be felt at mealtime. He is not going because travel is romantic. He is going because history has narrowed the choices. That kind of departure creates a special form of longing. It is not simply sadness, it is responsibility stretched across water. Cape Verdean migration would later be described through ideas like diaspora and transnationalism, but at the beginning, it was more intimate than academic words can capture. It was a letter carried home. It was money sent back when possible. It was news of work in America, Portugal, São Tomé, Angola, Senegal, or beyond. It was a barrel packed with food, clothing, or supplies. It was a child learning about an uncle overseas whose earnings helped repair a roof or buy grain. In time, migration became woven into the way Cape Verdeans imagined the world. The islands were small, but their families were not contained by the shoreline. This pattern did not erase suffering. The famine crises of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries left deep marks, and some were devastating. Historical studies identify major famines and epidemics as central to Cape Verde's population history. The 1940s were especially catastrophic, when drought and famine during the late colonial period destroyed the subsistence base for many islanders and drove thousands into labor migration, including to São Tomé and Príncipe and other Portuguese-controlled territories. But even before the 20th century, Cape Verde had already learned that hunger could rearrange society. It could depopulate areas, weaken families, make people vulnerable to exploitation, and push them into contracts or voyages they might never have chosen under better conditions. The pattern is painful because it shows how environmental fragility and colonial economics reinforced each other. If the land was difficult, fair administration might have softened the crisis. If colonial rule was extractive or neglectful, reliable rain might have hidden some of its failures. But when drought and poor governance met, ordinary people carried the weight. This is one reason Cape Verde's history has such a strong moral undertone without needing to be preached. The facts themselves reveal the imbalance. A distant empire valued the islands for location, labor, and strategic use. Yet the people living there often faced hunger with too little protection. Still, Cape Verdeans did not become only victims of climate or empire. They adapted with a stubborn intelligence that deserves attention. They used terraces, small plots, livestock, fishing, trade, seasonal work, and family networks. They developed habits of saving, sending, sharing, and moving. They learned to read uncertainty. A cloud over the mountain, a change in wind, a rumor of work abroad, a ship expected in port, each could matter. Survival required attention to signs. In that sense, Cape Verdean history is also a history of perception. People had to notice small changes because small changes could decide the future. The landscape trained them in watchfulness. The sea trained them in patience. Migration trained them in distance. And poverty, harsh as it was, taught that identity could not depend only on staying in one place. A homeland could be loved from afar. A language could survive in another country. A song could cross the ocean and return changed. A family could become an archipelago of its own, scattered across ports and islands, but still connected. This is where the story begins to shift from hunger to diaspora. The first departures were often acts of necessity, but over time they created pathways. One Cape Verdean who found work abroad could help another follow. A sailor who settled in New Bedford could become a point of contact for relatives and neighbors. A packet ship could carry not just goods, but letters, remittances, stories, and the feeling that the world beyond the islands was reachable. Every departure widened the map inside Cape Verdean imagination. The islands remained dry, poor, and vulnerable, but they were no longer isolated in the same way. They had people elsewhere. That fact would become one of the most important resources the nation ever had. Not gold, not oil, not great rivers, but people abroad who remembered home. And perhaps that is the deepest mystery of this chapter, how a place marked by scarcity could create such enduring attachment. Many lands that fail to feed their people lose them completely. Cape Verde did not. It sent people out, and those people kept looking back. The memory of drought did not destroy belonging. It made belonging more complicated, more painful, and in some ways more powerful. To be Cape Verdean became not only to live on the islands, but to carry the islands through absence. The dry fields, the stone houses, the waiting families, the ships at anchor, the uncertain sky, the long Atlantic road to New England and beyond, all of it became part of the same identity. By the time migration had taken root as a pattern, Cape Verde had become more than a colony of islands. It had become a people stretched across the sea. And that wider Cape Verde, the Cape Verde outside Cape Verde, would soon become one of the most important chapters in the nation's history. By the time Cape Verdeans began leaving in greater numbers, departure had become more than a response to hunger or poverty. It had become a second geography, a map drawn not only with islands, but with harbors, letters, ship routes, family names, and distant neighborhoods where the sound of Creole could still make a room feel close to home. This is the chapter where Cape Verde becomes larger than Cape Verde. On paper, it remained a small archipelago in the Atlantic, a chain of islands under Portuguese rule, limited by drought, distance, and colonial neglect. But in real life, its people were already stretching the meaning of nation before the nation officially existed. They were building a Cape Verde outside the islands, not through conquest, not through empire, but through movement. And that movement did something powerful. It turned absence into connection. A man could leave Brava or Fogo and end up in New Bedford, Massachusetts. A family could stay behind on Santiago and depend on money sent from a sailor across the ocean. A young woman could grow up hearing stories of relatives in Portugal, Senegal, Sao Tome, Holland, or America, and understand that the family tree had branches in places she had never seen. For many peoples, migration is an interruption in history. For Cape Verdeans, it became one of history's main roads. The earliest and most famous bridge to the United States ran through the sea itself. New England whaling ships regularly stopped in Cape Verde for supplies and crew, and Cape Verdean men joined those vessels, sailing into an industry that was dangerous, exhausting, and deeply tied to the rise of American maritime power. This is where the American listener may suddenly feel the story come closer. Cape Verde was not just a distant African island colony. Its people were part of the working history of the Atlantic seaboard. They moved through ports like New Bedford and Nantucket, not as tourists, not as symbols, but as laborers, sailors, settlers, and eventually neighbors. Some arrived for seasonal work and returned. Others stayed. Some came from islands like Brava and Fogo, places where opportunity was thin and the sea offered one of the few open doors. The whaling ship, for all its danger, was also a kind of moving border. A Cape Verdean who stepped aboard entered a world where nationality, language, race, skill, and survival all collided. At sea, a man's hands and discipline could matter more than his official status. But that did not mean prejudice disappeared. It only meant the ship forced people into temporary dependence. Men who might never have shared a table on land had to trust one another under sail, through storms, labor, and long months of uncertainty. When those sailors reached New England, especially southeastern Massachusetts, they created one of the oldest African immigrant communities in the United States. That fact is easy to overlook because Cape Verdean Americans have often been folded into broader categories: Portuguese-speaking, Black, African, Atlantic, immigrant, maritime, New England. But their story has its own shape. In New Bedford, Cape Verdeans were not arriving into an empty space. The city was already a port of many peoples: Irish, Portuguese from the Azores and Madeira, French Canadians, African Americans, and others tied to ships, mills, docks, and factories. Cape Verdeans entered that world with their own island memory, Catholic practices, foodways, music, family networks, and a language that could feel both intimate and invisible to outsiders. Over time, they formed neighborhoods, churches, clubs, mutual aid societies, and social ties that helped new arrivals find work, housing, and belonging. The diaspora was not just a scattering of individuals. It became a system of care. That matters because migration is often described in numbers, but it is lived through small acts. A cousin meets you at the dock. An older sailor explains which employer pays on time. A woman knows which family has room for one more person. A letter tells the village who has died, who has married, who has found work, who may send money next month. These details are not decorative. They are how a people survive distance. As whaling declined in the early 20th century, Cape Verdean maritime life did not simply vanish. Cape Verdean mariners and entrepreneurs helped maintain packet trade between the islands and New England, using vessels that carried passengers, goods, letters, food, and news across the ocean. These packet ships were more than transportation. They were floating lifelines. They made the diaspora feel less like exile and more like an extended household. A barrel could carry clothing, flour, coffee, tools, or small gifts. A letter could carry blessing, worry, instruction, or longing. A returning migrant could bring stories of American streets, factory work, racial barriers, wages, winter cold, and the strange feeling of living in a place where home was always both present and absent. Through these routes, Cape Verdeans learned to live in two directions at once. Their bodies might be in New England, Portugal, or West Africa, but their obligations still pointed toward the islands. This is one of the deepest features of the Cape Verdean diaspora. Leaving did not always break the relationship with home. It often intensified it. The person abroad became a bridge, and sometimes a burdened one. To succeed abroad was not only personal ambition, it could become a family responsibility. To fail abroad was not only private disappointment, it could mean shame, silence, or another difficult decision. The diaspora created opportunity, but it also created pressure. People who left were expected to remember. People who stayed were expected to wait. In between them moved remittances, stories, songs, and a kind of longing that became central to Cape Verdean culture. That longing was not passive. It did work. It preserved language. It kept island food alive in American kitchens. It carried music into community halls and family gatherings. It allowed Cape Verdeans in foreign cities to recognize one another through accent, surname, rhythm, humor, and shared memory. In this way, diaspora became a second homeland, but never a replacement. It was more like a mirror held across the water. The islands looked into it and saw both loss and survival. The migrants looked back and saw both origin and responsibility. This pattern was not limited to the United States. Cape Verdeans also moved through the Portuguese Empire and beyond it to places such as São Tomé and Príncipe, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, Portugal, the Netherlands, France, and later other parts of Europe. Each destination shaped the community differently. In Portugal, Cape Verdeans lived within the language and political world of the colonial power, but often from the margins of that world. In São Tomé, some Cape Verdeans worked under harsh labor arrangements on plantations, a reminder that migration under colonial rule could be closer to compulsion than freedom. In Senegal, proximity to West Africa created older regional ties. In the Netherlands and France, post-war labor demand and later family reunification helped build new communities. The diaspora was never one story. It was many stories connected by the same islands. Some migrants found dignity and stability. Others found discrimination, dangerous work, loneliness, and the ache of being misunderstood. Some returned home with savings and status. Others never returned at all, except through letters, photographs, music, or children taught to speak of islands they had never visited. This is why Cape Verdean identity became so unusual. It was not weakened by distance in the way outsiders might expect. Distance became part of the identity. To be Cape Verdean could mean living in Praia, Mindelo, or a mountain village on Santo Antão. But it could also mean living in Brockton, New Bedford, Lisbon, Rotterdam, Paris, Dakar, or São Tomé, and still feeling that the islands were not behind you, but inside you. In many countries, national feeling is built by schools, armies, flags, and official language. For Cape Verdeans, long before full independence, national feeling also travelled through kitchens, ports, dance halls, letters, and remittance routes. The diaspora quietly prepared the imagination of nationhood. It showed that Cape Verde was not merely a colonial territory divided by islands, but a people capable of recognizing one another across oceans. That recognition mattered. It helped preserve a shared culture, even when colonial rule tried to define the islands from the outside. It gave Cape Verdeans experience with the wider world. It created communities that could later support political ideas, education, cultural pride, and economic survival. And it made one fact impossible to ignore. Cape Verde's future could never be understood only from inside Cape Verde. The islands were small, but the people had become Atlantic. Their history was now spread through shipping records, church registers, family stories, American port cities, Portuguese neighborhoods, African plantations, European factories, and songs of longing that seemed to know the ocean personally. Yet there was also a quiet danger in this success of survival. A people cannot live forever only by leaving. Migration kept families alive, but it also exposed the failure of the colonial system to build security at home. Every departure asked an unanswered question. Why must so many people go elsewhere in order for the islands to endure? By the 20th century, that question began to sound less like private sorrow and more like politics. Cape Verdeans had learned to belong across water, but they had also learned what dependence felt like. They knew what it meant to wait for ships, wages, decisions, and relief from powers far away. The diaspora gave them strength, but it also revealed the limits of life under colonial rule. A people scattered across the Atlantic could remember home, support home, sing of home, and dream of home. But one day, they would also have to ask who had the right to govern home. And that question would lead the story toward the long road of resistance, political awakening, and independence. By the middle of the 20th century, Cape Verde's question was no longer only how to survive drought, poverty, and distance. A deeper question had begun to rise beneath the old colonial order. Who had the right to decide the future of these islands? For centuries, Portugal had treated Cape Verde as an overseas possession, a place tied to empire by law, language, church, administration, and habit. But colonial rule often lasts longest when it convinces people that nothing else is possible. What changed in the 20th century was not one sudden event, but a slow awakening across the Portuguese-speaking African world. Students, workers, sailors, teachers, and migrants began to see their struggles as connected. Cape Verde's hunger was not separate from Guinea-Bissau's poverty. Angola's forced labor was not separate from Mozambique's political repression. The same empire that claimed to bring civilization had left deep inequalities, limited education, weak infrastructure, and a population expected to endure more than it was allowed to shape. Out of that atmosphere came one of the most important figures in modern African history, Amilcar Cabral. He was born in 1924 in Portuguese Guinea, now Guinea-Bissau, to Cape Verdean parents, and that double connection mattered. Cabral belonged emotionally and politically to both Guinea and Cape Verde, and he understood that the two territories, though different in landscape and society, had been tied together by Portuguese colonialism. He was not simply a man with slogans. He was trained as an agronomist, a student of soil, crops, land, and rural life, and that gave his politics an unusual weight. He did not look at liberation as a flag ceremony alone. He looked at the ground beneath people's feet. He understood that colonialism was not only police, governors, and laws. It was also hunger, illiteracy, dependence, and the quiet humiliation of people being told they were unfit to rule themselves. When Cabral conducted agricultural work and surveys in Guinea-Bissau, he gained something more valuable than theory. He learned the villages, the rivers, the farmers, the conditions of ordinary people, and the practical geography of resistance. This is why his leadership carried such force. He could speak of freedom not as a distant dream, but as something rooted in cassava fields, rice paddies, schools, language, and dignity. In 1956, Cabral and other anti-colonial militants founded the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, known as the PAIGC. At first, the hope was not necessarily that war would be the only path. Like many liberation movements, the PAIGC began with political organization, persuasion, education, and attempts to build consciousness among people who had long been governed from outside. But Portugal, under the Estado Novo dictatorship, refused to let go of its African colonies. While other European empires were beginning to retreat after World War II, Portugal insisted that its colonies were not colonies at all, but overseas provinces, as if changing the word could erase the structure. That refusal narrowed the road. The PAIGC's struggle became one of the most organized anti-colonial movements in Africa, but it is important to be precise. The armed struggle took place mainly in Guinea-Bissau, not in the Cape Verde Islands themselves. Cape Verde's geography, surveillance, and political conditions made open guerrilla warfare there far less possible. But the islands were still central to the idea of liberation. Cape Verdeans joined the movement, supported it through networks abroad, carried its ideas, debated its future, and saw in it a way to end a colonial relationship that had shaped their lives for generations. Cabral's genius was that he did not reduce the struggle to weapons. He believed that a people had to know themselves before they could be free. In the liberated areas of Guinea-Bissau, the PAIGC tried to build schools, health services, local administration, and political education, even while the conflict continued. This was not romantic or easy. It was improvised, under pressure, often in harsh conditions, and it depended on discipline, sacrifice, and support from rural communities. But it showed Cabral's deeper idea. Independence had to begin before independence was officially declared. A people had to practice self-rule before the world recognized their state. That is why his speeches and writings still feel alive. He warned against easy victories, against pretending the people were stronger than they were, against copying foreign revolutions without understanding local reality. He believed culture was not decoration. Culture was a source of resistance, because colonialism often tries to make people doubt their own history, language, and value. For Cape Verde, this mattered deeply. A people shaped by Creole identity, migration, drought, and colonial hierarchy needed a politics that did not treat them as an imitation of Portugal or a footnote to Guinea. Cabral's vision tried to hold both territories together while respecting the complexity of each. He imagined Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde moving toward independence as connected parts of a wider African liberation project. That idea was bold, and not everyone would interpret it the same way. Some saw unity as a path to strength, joining an island society and a mainland territory into a shared future. Others, later on, would question whether the differences between the two were too large to sustain one political destiny. History would eventually answer that question in its own hard way. But during the liberation struggle, the dream of unity gave the PAIGC a clear moral and political horizon. The movement was not asking merely for reforms or better treatment or a softer form of colonialism. It was asking for the end of foreign rule. Then, in January 1973, Amilcar Cabral was assassinated in Conakry, Guinea, before he could see the independence he had worked toward. The loss was enormous. Movements often build themselves around ideas, but ideas still need voices, discipline, and trust. And Cabral had become the voice many people associated with the future. His death could have broken the movement's momentum. Instead, it became part of the memory that carried it forward. Later that same year, the PAIGC declared Guinea-Bissau independent, though Portugal did not immediately recognize it. The turning point came not only from the battlefield, but from Portugal itself. In April 1974, the Carnation Revolution overthrew the dictatorship in Lisbon, and suddenly the empire that had seemed immovable began to loosen. Soldiers, politicians, and citizens in Portugal were exhausted by colonial wars in Africa. The cost had become too high, morally, politically, and economically. For Cape Verde, this created the opening that armed struggle alone had not created on the islands. Negotiations followed. A transitional government was formed. The path to independence became real, not as a fantasy whispered in exile, but as an approaching date on the calendar. What makes this chapter so powerful is the way it gathers so many strands of Cape Verdean history into one political moment. The old Atlantic colony, the Creole society, the drought-scarred islands, the families abroad, the sailors in New England, the students in Lisbon, the militants in Guinea, the villages waiting for change. All of them were connected by the same question of self-determination. Independence did not mean that hunger would disappear, or that migration would end, or that the wounds of colonialism would heal overnight. Cabral himself would likely have rejected such a simple story. Freedom was not magic, it was responsibility. But the struggle changed the meaning of Cape Verde. The islands were no longer only a place history had used, they were becoming a people ready to name themselves in the world. And as the colonial order finally began to crack, Cape Verde stood at the edge of a new dawn. Not yet free, not yet secure, but close enough to hear the first footsteps of a nation approaching. On July 5, 1975, Cape Verde became a country in its own name, and the moment carried a strange quietness that history sometimes gives to the most important days. There were no vast armies marching across a continent, no capital city collapsing in smoke, no ancient throne being overturned in a single dramatic scene. Instead, on a chain of dry Atlantic islands, after centuries of being governed from far away, a small people stepped across an invisible line. One day they were still officially tied to the Portuguese Empire. The next, they belonged to the Republic of Cape Verde. But independence was not a magic door that opened into ease. It was more like dawn over difficult land, beautiful, long-awaited, and immediately demanding. Only 5 days earlier, on June 30th, Cape Verdeans had elected a National Assembly, a body meant to receive the instruments of independence from Portugal and give the new state its first political shape. That detail matters because it shows how independence arrived through a formal transfer of power rather than a sudden military takeover on the islands. It came through negotiation, organization, and a tense political transition made possible by changes in Portugal after the Carnation Revolution. But for the people of Cape Verde, official procedure was only the surface. Beneath it was memory. The memory of drought, the memory of ships leaving the harbor, the memory of families divided between islands and foreign cities, the memory of colonial classrooms, poor fields, long Catholic processions, Creole speech in ordinary homes, and the feeling that decisions about the islands had too often been made somewhere else. July 5th gathered all of that into one day. It was not simply the end of Portuguese rule, it was the beginning of responsibility. Aristides Pereira became the first president, and Pedro Pires became the first prime minister, two names that would stand at the entrance of Cape Verde's new political era. They inherited a country with a flag, a government, and international recognition, but not the comfortable foundation that larger or wealthier nations might take for granted. Cape Verde had no great mineral wealth to lean on, no large river system to feed endless agriculture, no broad domestic market, and no easy way to escape the limits of geography. Its greatest resources were human ones: discipline, education, migration networks, cultural identity, and the ability to survive on the edge of scarcity. That may sound modest, but for Cape Verde, it was the real beginning. A nation is not built only by land. It is built by trust, by institutions, by the belief that a shared future is possible, even when the ground itself is poor. On that Independence Day, the new leaders had to turn a scattered archipelago into a functioning state. That meant schools, ports, roads, food security, health systems, diplomacy, and administration across islands separated by water. It meant asking people who had long survived through family networks and migration to also believe in national institutions. It meant turning the emotion of liberation into the quieter work of governing. This is often where independence stories become more complicated than the celebration suggests. The flag rises quickly. The work beneath it takes generations. Cape Verde's challenge was especially delicate because its identity had always been stretched across distance. Many Cape Verdeans lived abroad, especially in Portugal, the United States, Senegal, the Netherlands, France, São Tomé, and other places connected by labor, empire, and migration. So the new republic had to speak not only to those standing on the islands, but also to those listening from far away. A Cape Verdean in New Bedford or Lisbon could feel the date as deeply as someone in Praia or Mindelo, because independence was not only a political event, it was a correction of belonging. For generations, the islands had been known through another power's language of possession. Now the name Cape Verde could stand in world affairs as a subject rather than an object. That change may seem symbolic, but symbols matter when people have been treated as peripheral. To raise a flag is to say, we are not merely a stopover, not merely a labor reserve, not merely an old colonial station in the Atlantic. We are a people. We remember ourselves. Still, If you listen closely to the atmosphere of 1975, you can feel both pride and anxiety moving together. The end of empire did not erase dependence. Food still had to be imported. Rain still could fail. Jobs were still limited. Many families still relied on relatives abroad. A young state could declare sovereignty, but it could not declare away the Atlantic winds or the thin soil. This is what makes Cape Verde's independence so moving. It was not the triumph of abundance, but the courage of beginning without abundance. The new government had to build from scarcity, and scarcity forces clarity. What can a nation become when it cannot rely on size, oil, or military power? For Cape Verde, the answer would have to come through stability, education, diplomacy, diaspora ties, and careful management of limited resources. But none of that was guaranteed in 1975. Newly independent countries often faced internal conflict, economic breakdown, Cold War pressure, and the difficult transition from liberation movement to governing party. Cape Verde was not outside those pressures. It emerged during a tense global moment when small states were often pulled toward larger ideological struggles. The PAIGC had led the liberation movement for both Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, and early independence carried the hope of unity between the two territories. But even at the start, there were differences that could not be ignored. Guinea-Bissau was a mainland country that had endured a long armed struggle. Cape Verde was an island society shaped by Creole culture, migration, drought, and a different colonial experience. The dream of shared political destiny had power, especially because Amilcar Cabral had imagined liberation across both lands. But history was already testing whether that dream could survive the realities of governing. For the ordinary person on July 5th, such questions may have felt distant compared with the immediate emotion of the day. Imagine Praia in the heat, people gathering, voices rising, officials preparing documents, the old colonial order retreating into memory but not yet gone from the habits of life. Imagine elders who had seen famine standing beside young people who had grown up hearing the language of liberation. Imagine families with sons and daughters abroad trying to understand what this meant for them. A country can be born in a ceremony, but it is also born in the private mind. When a person suddenly realizes that the future may no longer have to be explained through a foreign capital. That realization does not make life easier overnight, but it changes the direction of hope. It gives hardship a new frame. Hunger under colonial rule can feel like abandonment. Hardship under independence, though still painful, can feel like a problem the nation must solve for itself. That difference is subtle, but it is enormous. Cape Verde's independence also changed the meaning of its past. The old islands of settlement, slavery, Creole formation, famine, and migration could now be gathered into a national story. What had once seemed like separate experiences became chapters of one identity. Cidade Velha was no longer only a ruin of Portuguese expansion. It was a witness to Cape Verdean beginnings. Creole was no longer simply the speech of ordinary people below official Portuguese. It was part of the soul of the nation. The diaspora was no longer merely the consequence of poverty. It was an extension of national life. Even drought, painful as it was, became part of the story of endurance. This is how nations often form. not by forgetting suffering, but by rearranging it into memory with purpose. Yet there is danger in making the story too clean. Independence did not solve every injustice. It did not automatically create democracy in the modern multi-party sense. It did not end poverty, migration, or political tension. It did not make all Cape Verdeans agree about the best path forward. But it gave them a country in which disagreement could eventually become part of national life rather than colonial administration. That is why July 5th should be understood not as a final victory, but as the first breath of statehood. The moment was powerful because it opened a question rather than closed one. What kind of country could Cape Verde become? A fragile island republic could fail, or it could slowly prove that smallness was not the same as weakness. It could be swallowed by dependence, or it could turn its scattered people into a global strength. It could remain haunted by scarcity, or it could build a political culture around restraint, literacy, diplomacy, and survival. On that day in 1975, none of those outcomes was certain. That uncertainty is what makes the scene feel alive. The people celebrating independence were not characters at the end of a story. They were people at the edge of responsibility, carrying centuries behind them and an unwritten future ahead. As the new republic entered the world, the Atlantic around it remained the same vast water that had shaped everything before. Ships would still leave. Rain would still be watched. Families would still be divided by distance. But something essential had changed. Cape Verde was no longer waiting for history to be handed down from elsewhere. It had taken the pen, however fragile its hand, and begun to write its own name. After independence, Cape Verde entered a quieter but more difficult test than the ceremony of freedom itself, the test of governing. The new state had inherited a powerful liberation memory, but memory could not build roads by itself, or fill classrooms, or bring rain, or keep families from leaving when work disappeared. In the first years, political life was shaped by the PAIGC, the party that had led the struggle for the independence of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, and then, after the relationship with Guinea-Bissau broke apart, by its Cape Verdean successor, the PAICV. For a time, Cape Verde lived under a one-party system, a model that many newly independent countries adopted in the 1970s under the belief that unity was necessary for survival. From the outside, it is easy to judge that choice too quickly. But inside the moment, the fear was real. A young country with little wealth, scattered islands, fragile agriculture, and a population stretched across the world could seem too vulnerable for open political competition. Leaders worried that parties might divide the nation before the nation was strong enough to hold itself together. Yet the same argument that promised unity also narrowed public life. If one party speaks for the nation, where does disagreement go? If criticism is treated as disloyalty, how does a society correct itself? Cape Verde's first political era carried that tension in a very island-like way. Calm on the surface, careful beneath it. Always aware that stability was precious but not free. The government invested in education, health, administration, and the slow work of building institutions across water. It had to think island by island. Santiago could not simply stand in for Santo Antão, São Vicente, Fogo, Brava, Sal, Boa Vista, Maio, or São Nicolau. Each island had its own needs: ports, roads, schools, shortages, and moods. Governing Cape Verde meant governing separation. A decision made in Praia had to cross the sea before it became real. That geography helped keep the state modest in some ways. There was no vast army marching through a continent, no huge oil field to seize, no powerful military class able to dominate national life through force. Cape Verde's poverty was painful, but its lack of certain temptations may have helped protect it from some of the disasters that struck other post-colonial states. Still, smallness did not make politics simple. The dream of unity with Guinea-Bissau, so important to Amilcar Cabral's vision, began to collapse after the 1980 coup in Bissau. That event forced Cape Verde to look more clearly at its own path. The shared liberation movement had imagined two territories tied together by history and struggle, but the differences were deep. One was a mainland country marked by guerrilla war, ethnic diversity, and military politics. The other was a Creole island society with a large diaspora, no major armed struggle on its own soil, and a different rhythm of political life. When Cape Verde moved away from the Unity Project and the PAICV became a distinct national party, the country was not only changing organizations, it was accepting that its future would have to be built from its own island reality. That realization mattered. A nation cannot borrow another country's destiny forever, even when the histories are connected. Through the 1980s, Cape Verde remained under one-party rule, but the world around it was changing. Economic hardship continued. Migration remained central. The Cold War order that had shaped many post-colonial alliances began to weaken. Across Africa and beyond, citizens were asking for more political space, more accountability, and more choice. In Cape Verde, the pressure for opening did not explode into a violent rupture. It moved more like the tide, slowly, steadily, difficult to stop once it had turned. By 1990, constitutional reforms opened the way to multi-party politics, and the movement for democracy, known as the MPD, emerged as the major opposition force. This was one of the most important turns in Cape Verdean history, because it tested whether the country's famous stability was real or only the result of political control. In January 1991, Cape Verde held its first multi-party parliamentary election, and the MPD defeated the ruling PAICV. That could have become a dangerous moment. In many young states, a ruling party that loses after years in power tries to bend the system, delay the result, intimidate opponents, or claim that national unity is under threat. Cape Verde did something more powerful precisely because it looked less dramatic. It allowed power to move. The transfer was peaceful. The opposition became government. The old ruling party became opposition. The state survived. That single act may be one of the most underrated achievements in the country's modern history. Democracy is not proven by holding an election once. It is proven by what the losers do afterward. Cape Verde's transition showed that institutions could matter more than personalities, and that political identity could expand beyond the Liberation Party without destroying the nation the Liberation Party had helped create. Antonio Mascarenhas Monteiro later became president. Carlos Vega became prime minister, and the country entered a new constitutional era. The 1992 Constitution gave stronger form to multi-party democracy, civil liberties, and the balance of power, helping turn the opening of 1991 into a more durable system. But the real story was never only legal language. It was the gradual creation of habits. Parties campaign, citizens vote, results are accepted, newspapers criticize, courts matter, presidents and prime ministers share authority, and governments change without the country feeling as if it has fallen off a cliff. For a small island nation, those habits became a kind of invisible infrastructure, just as important as roads or ports. Cape Verde still had serious problems: poverty, unemployment, dependence on tourism and remittances, transportation challenges between islands, pressure on water, and the constant vulnerability of a small economy in a large world. But its politics began to carry a reputation for restraint. The PAICV returned to power through elections. The MPD returned later. Presidents and prime ministers from different parties sometimes had to work within the same political system. This alternation gave Cape Verde something rare. Citizens could imagine government as temporary, not permanent property. That is a quiet revolution in any democracy. It means the state belongs to the public more than to any single party. It means yesterday's rulers can become tomorrow's critics, and today's critics can become tomorrow's rulers. Of course, Cape Verde was never perfect, and a serious history should not pretend otherwise. Democracy can be stable and still incomplete. Courts can exist and still be slow. Elections can be competitive and still leave people frustrated by inequality. A free society can still struggle with crime, corruption concerns, gender inequities, or the feeling that politics happens too far from ordinary life. But the deeper achievement is that Cape Verde created a system where those problems could be argued about openly rather than hidden beneath colonial rule or one-party certainty. The country's smallness may have helped here too. In a small society, leaders are not distant shadows. They are often names people know, faces people recognize, families people can place. That closeness can create pressure, but it can also create accountability. The diaspora added another layer. Cape Verdeans abroad watched, sent money, returned with ideas, voted in some contexts, and kept comparing the islands with the wider world. A country that has so many people overseas cannot seal itself off easily. Its citizens are always bringing back impressions of Boston, Lisbon, Rotterdam, Paris, Dakar, and beyond. That openness helped make Cape Verde's democracy feel Atlantic, not isolated. By the 21st century, the country had become known as one of Africa's more stable democracies, not because it had escaped hardship, but because it had managed hardship without surrendering public life to violence or permanent rule. That is why the final chapter of Cape Verde's story should not end with a shout, but with a long, thoughtful breath. The islands that began as silent volcanic land became a colonial outpost, a slave trade crossroads, a Creole society, a land of drought and migration, a nation of memory, and finally, a small republic that learned how to change governments without breaking itself. Its story is not the story of overwhelming power. It is the story of endurance refined into institutions. And as night settles again over the Atlantic, Cape Verde remains small on the map, but not small in history. It is a reminder that a nation does not need a vast territory to carry a vast human experience. Sometimes a handful of islands, held together by language, longing, discipline, and the sea, can teach the world something quieter and more lasting, that survival is only the beginning.